All right, so as we start in with neuroanatomy, I want to talk a little bit about how the nervous system is organized. Right? So, how are we covering neuroanatomy? At least the basics that we'll cover here. I'm trying to limit lectures, and I'm trying to put that more into the study guide that we've talked about a little bit, and we've talked about how we're going to cover that. I am going to provide you a few little lectures here to give you some of the basics, and we will have some more in class as well. At the end of completing the study guide and the lectures, we're all going to play Neuroanatomy Jeopardy on Wednesday, and that's a nice sort of way to really give yourself an honest check about how well you understand all this. And then at the end, I'll provide you with the answers to this as well. All right, so the nervous system can be divided up in many different ways. One of the main ways that we talk about it is the central and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system being kind of the part of the nervous system you think of as the nervous system. That's your brain in particular. It's also your spinal cord. And it's also one more thing that, as somebody who studies vision, is always a little upsetting. It includes your eye, in particular your retina. These are all parts of the central nervous system, right? As opposed to the peripheral nervous system, which is basically everything outside of this, right? These are the nerves that go to your skin, that drive your muscles, and give you the senses of touch and everything, right? Now, they're very important distinctions between what these do, but some of the key ones is that your peripheral nervous system, at least to me, this is an important thing, that regenerates reasonably well, right? You know this, like if you cut your finger doesn't go permanently numb, but I think we all know that if you have a spinal cord injury, that's going to usually have lifelong effects, right? Because it doesn't really regenerate. Same thing goes to vision. This is why people who are blind stay blind, right? Or why we're all worried about sort of concussions and things like that. Right? And some other things that we'll talk about later is the whole architecture tends to be different. We'll talk about how myelination is different. The synapses, we won't actually get into that too much here, but the synapses themselves tend to be a little bit different. And if you're somebody who's used to looking at brain cells, the way they work is just different. Another way you can divide up the nervous system is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. A quick way to talk about those is the sympathetic nervous system is sort of fight or flight, and the parasympathetic nervous system is rest and digest. So the sympathetic nervous system kind of gets you ready to do something. This is what you do when you have to be active. The parasympathetic is like, what are you doing to relax? And your body still needs to do important functions, for example, like digesting, recovering, and things, but it kind of changes what parts are going to be active. I'm going to kind of let you look at this because this is a thing that's very hard to explain in this format. It's much easier when I can sort of show you real things. But when we look at the brain, it's a 3D object, right? And we can really only look in a book or on a computer screen in sort of 2 dimensions, right? So we have different terms for how we look at things. And so you can talk about how you basically cut the brain, right? The coronal plane is right here, and so that looks like this. And the horizontal plane is cutting through here, so you can look top down or bottom up, right? And this may be useful when you're sort of digging through information, and it might give you a different picture, and it'll tell you, oh, this is a sagittal look at the hippocampus, for example. And you can know, like, oh, I'm sort of looking at the side, and the hippocampus is in here, right? Some basic anatomical terms. This is more here, just so you have a quick reference. A couple that I want to focus on, these are the most used ones, sort of dorsal top, ventral sort of bottom, or more sort of belly, I guess, anterior towards the front, posterior towards the back. All of these terms will get used from time to time. Other important ones are ipsilateral and contralateral. We'll learn this a lot, but the brain, oftentimes, for example, if we talk about the motor cortex, left motor cortex up here is going to control the right side of your body. So that's contralateral, meaning opposite. Some things stay on the same side, So they would be ipsilateral. Other terms that may come up, and these we won't spend too much time on either, but just so you know when you have them here. All right, the brain. This is what everybody's most interested in. One thing I like to take is sort of a evolutionary perspective about thinking about how the brain works. And so if we see here, we have a mouse brain and a rat brain, and this is a sheep's brain. You can see how they change in size, but hopefully you're also noting that they sort of are changing in structure. Here you're looking top down, here you're looking at the bottom of them. And as we learn about them, these here are going to be called the cortices, or the cortex. And you can see, and then this will be known sort of as the hindbrain. This is sort of the older part of the brain evolutionarily. And you can see that as a percentage, this makes up more of a mouse's brain than it does of a sheep's brain. And that tells you a little bit something about what these different do. These areas up here end up being more important for sort of higher cognitive functions. And then here we have the human brain, where it's massive cortex, all these deep grooves and everything that we're used to seeing. This is mostly here for your own reference, and it'll actually answer a ton of the questions for you in your study guide. And yeah, I don't think we need to spend too much time here. This is the sort of lecture that I'm trying to avoid having to do when I think it's just as easy for you to sort of read through. If you have any questions, though, please make sure to reach out. A part of the brain that is not thought of as much as the ventricles. These are these fluid-filled sacs in your brain that basically give it its shape. That sort of brain shape that we showed earlier that you're used to thinking, this big, wrinkly, football shape sort of thing. Without the ventricles, it wouldn't look like that. You would actually, if you took somebody's brain out without ventricles, it just kind of mush down, kind of look like a little puddle of brain. And obviously that's not what we need our brain to look at. We need it to have the structure so it keeps its function. And so you can see here, we're not going to dive, super important that you know all of these, the lateral ventricles being on the outside here. But the key thing I would actually remember is there are a lot of issues here. If you've heard about people having hydrocephaly, right, their brain is getting swelled up, and that's pressing the brain, causes massive headaches. A lot of time that's due to blockage in these ventricles. And so these ventricles are filled with fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, and it has to cycle through here. And if you end up with too much fluid in your brain, it's going to sort of squish that brain, and that's not good either. So we need to be able to fluid. And you can see in some of these ventricles, there's some obvious narrowing. And these ventricles actually end up going all the way down your spinal cord. And if these get so narrow that it blocks, that's a big problem. CSF also fills the area between the meninges, which is the sort of outer layer that protects the brain, and the skull. And you can have, and that sort of provides a little bit of a cushion for your brain against the skull. Oh, also one quick thing, the cerebrospinal fluid is made by by the choroid plexus, which is more of a trivia thing at this point than anything. So, like the brain, we can take a cross-section of the spinal cord, and it's a little bit easier to look at it. As far as what you need to know, I always find this is, so we can use these terms here, right? We're looking, this is the ventral, and the top here is the dorsal side. And the key thing I always like to get students to know from this is that dorsal is normally important for sensation, at least their senses of touch. This is where the nerves leave the spinal cord and go out to your fingers and things so you can feel. Whereas ventral is important for motor, right? This is going to connect to muscles and cause them to move and flex as you do, right? So if we see this, all along your spinal cord, you'll have these different sort of repeating elements where you have different nerve roots that they're called. The ones that leave dorsally are your sensory nerve roots, and the ones here are the motor nerve roots. And they will carry the axon fibers that do motor and sensation. Also, right next to them, there's a place called the dorsal root ganglion that's right here. And that's where the sort of neurons for sensation actually live. and they put one fiber out and one fiber into the spinal cord. I feel it's important to talk about the retina because this is what I do. The important takeaway I want you to think about the retina is that, and we'll come back to this with sensation, is that it's got a number of different special cells. It can sense light, and that's what it does there, and then it takes that information and transmits it to the brain. The other thing I want you to see here, and I always think that's super pretty, probably one of the reasons I work on the retina, is that look at how nicely it is divided into layers. Just kind of looks like nice little flat pancakes on top of each other. This is something that's used throughout the brain. All the structures almost in the brain itself for sure, and you kind of were seeing that in the spinal cord, layer on top of each other in a ordered fashion. This is important for brain structure. All right, so this is the last slide for this lecture, but I want you to come back to think about the evolutionary perspective on the brain. If we look here, we're looking at a bunch of different brains, and their prefrontal cortex is highlighted in blue. Now, the prefrontal cortex is the very front of the brain, right, basically, and that's what's often, it's sort of a failsafe. If there's sort of something that sounds like a complex cognitive function, a higher order function, you can always just sort of answer it. It's probably the prefrontal cortex that does that, and you're probably right. But it is important for sort of a wide range of things. But what I'm hoping you can see here is that sort of as we get to sort of higher order animals, right, humans in general, the prefrontal cortex makes up a larger percentage of our brain than it does for a squirrel monkey, for example. And so, a chimp is a higher level on sort of the evolutionary chain than a rhesus monkey, than a squirrel monkey, right? Now, the prefrontal cortex seems to be important. It's important for higher order planning, but it's also important. It's where some people would say something like empathy lives. It seems to be key in sort of knowing how other people are feeling and sort of reacting to that. That seems to actually be, some people argue, a very important thing for a human to do. It's important for detecting lying, they think, in sort of higher functions like this. Amongst a million sort of other things, to be honest, sort of deep thought and, depression is often thought to be dysregulation in the prefrontal cortex amongst, other parts of the limbic system as well. Now, one question I'm going to leave you with that we'll talk about in the next class is, look at this. The cat has an extremely small prefrontal cortex relative to the rest of the brain. But, evolutionarily, cat is maybe even a little more advanced than the dog in general, but this dog has quite a large prefrontal cortex. Based on what you're finding about what the prefrontal cortex does and what I've talked about here, why do you think a cat has a smaller one than a dog? Right? So we'll come back to that in class later. All right, have a